I'm going to talk about summer diseases in general, and this is the one that I actually started working on because for many, many years, for my whole career, we really didn't have anything except for sooty blotch and fly speck. And while it is kind of a nuisance disease, and it can certainly decrease the value of apples, um, relative to the rots, it's not that damaging to the apples or the tree, and it's I think relatively easier to control. This damage is basically cosmetic. It's a disease complex caused by a whole bunch of different kinds of fungi, but basically you get the fly specks, the sort of spots that you see on the apple on the left, and you see some on the right, and then the smudgy blotchiness, which is the sooty blotch. More recently, we've been seeing other things, which are the rots. And first, before I get into the gruesome details on the fruit, these things show up as foliar problems. And one that's been around forever, but was never all that important economically in terms of the fruit, is black rot, which shows up on the leaves as frog eye leaf spot. More recently, we've been seeing things, even a really southern disease like glomerella leaf spot. And here I've got a couple of pictures, one showing early symptoms, and then later on when the leaf is pretty much done in, completely chlorotic. And you'll notice that looks a lot like another disease that has shown up in the last 5 years, Marsanina leaf spot or leaf blotch. And so it's a little bit difficult to differentiate the two. I don't think, at least up in Massachusetts, that we are really seeing a lot of glomerella yet. They've seen it in the Hudson Valley some years, but not so much up here. But certainly Marsanina we have seen. And the problem, at least the foliar problem that arises, is that the disease, if it gets bad enough, can defoliate the tree. And if that happens, then that's going to cause premature fruit drop and generally not be good for the health of the tree. So foliar problems can be serious enough that they, in and of themselves, are an issue. But really, the most immediate and important issue that we've seen pop up on occasion in the last 3 or 4 years are fruit rots. So here's the old disease that we have had around, which has gotten more serious on some varieties. And I think part of that is a varietal susceptibility problem, in that the newer varieties we're planting tend to be more susceptible to the diseases, and also a bit of change in the weather. One of the things I'd point out here with black rot, right in between those two fruit, you see a fruit mummy. That is a fruit that was infected, fruitlet that was infected the previous year. It has inoculum, which it's been dumping on the leaf tissue, on the leaves and the fruit. And you see a fairly well-developed black rot infection on the left of that apple, and then a new one on the right. And then you go over on the right side of picture, and you see a complete meltdown of fruit that has black rot. And while these are infrequent, we are seeing them more often in recent years. Another thing that has shown up much more commonly, never really used to see it a lot, is bitter rot. And here you can see it's distinct. If we go back here, yeah, they have concentric target-shaped patterning on that black rot, but you see here these sort of raised ridges in the target pattern, and also lots of spore production. That's what those pinky salmony things are. And if you were to cut that fruit open, whereas in the black rot, the tissue wouldn't have this nice triangular pattern, in bitter rot it does. One of the big things that is important to do at this point in the season, it's a little bit late in the day, but you could go back and do it, is to clean things up and try to get uh, the source of spores that are causing black rot, for example, in this slide, out of the orchard. So that could be those old mummies, or it can also be wood tissue. Uh, Black rot is an opportunistic fungus. Uh, it takes advantage of old stressed trees. You'll often see black rot cankers that move into fire blight cankers, and then they sit there and cause even more damage themselves. Other in old stress trees, you can see twigs and then branches that get infected, and then those are sources of the inoculum that eventually can infect fruit. So best to get that stuff out of there. Another source of inoculum is the leaves on the ground, and this is particularly true of the glomerella leaf spot and Marcelina leaf blotch. And so when you're going through thinking you're getting scab, yes, you are, but you're also going to be able to knock out a lot of the inoculum for these foliar diseases. So it's an added incentive to make sure you do sanitation. And I've just got a couple of flail mowers here working to clean up orchards, but you also, if you team that up with urea, you're going to get a much better results. So keep that in mind if you have been having these problems. As I said, part of the issue here is climate change, and we are at this point someplace around northern to middle of New Jersey, I guess, in the projection of things relative to where we were, say, in the 70s and 80s. So getting warmer and wetter. And that's important because the risk of all of these summer diseases goes up as we get higher humidity, rain, and warmer weather, particularly warmer night temperatures. As I said, also, these diseases were never an issue up here until recent years. They always were things that my colleagues in the North Carolina or Virginia or Maryland, places like that might talk about, but they were sort of exotic. But now they've moved in and we're seeing them more regularly. And if you've seen them in your orchard, that's an indication that you're probably going to need to pay more attention to managing them. And that's going to, unfortunately, probably mean using more summer fungicides than you have used in the past. Here's another example. The EBDCs are very good against all of these pathogens. So diethane, manzate, pancozeb, mannate, polyram. Great materials against sooty blotch and fly speck, and also against the rots. But the problem is that with the change in the label in the 90s, you can't use them within 77 days of harvest. In other words, you can't use them for most of the summer, and that presents a problem for most cultivars. You could push things into the later part of June for cultivars that you might be harvesting late, and that might not be a bad idea because these are very effective summer fungicides. So if you can figure out a way to use them in selected blocks, it's not a bad idea. The other broad spectrum, the other multi-site pest fungicide that's good against these diseases is Captan. In tests in the southeast, if it's not stretched, it is very effective against the rots. And similarly against sooty blotch and fly speck. But if you do stretch it, then it's not so good. And by stretching, I mean this rule of thumb for a standard rate of Captan is that it'll be effective for about 14 days or 1.5 inches of rain. In the North Carolina trials that Sarah Villani was talking about at the winter meetings this year, the New England meetings, adding prophyte boosted the efficacy of Captan. It gave another 7 days, another half-inch of rain in terms of its longevity and its efficacy in terms of managing the rot diseases that she's most concerned with, bitter rot in particular. The other very effective group of fungicides are the FRAC 11s, the strobies or QOI fungicides. So these include things like Flint Extra, Sovereign, Maravon, Luna Sensation, and Pristine. The last three are combos with other fungicides, but all of those materials are very good, and in particular, Maravon and Pristine have been very effective against all of the summer diseases. If we're looking at managing sooty blotch and fly speck, they will extend to 21 days or 2 to 2.5 inches of rain, except when you have very extreme warm, wet weather. And there, you might have to tighten that up to a 10 to 14 day interval. So those are the most effective materials. And in terms of their use, I think you want to use the strobies in either your last application or maybe your last two if you haven't started to, if you're not exceeding the label limits on the number of applications you can put on. So you have to pay some attention to that. But in those later applications, those are, that's the best time to use them, with one exception, which I'll show you here. So bottom line is that in dry weather, which we certainly have been having out in Western Mass anyway recently, you can extend these intervals a little bit, but in wet weather, you want to shorten them up. I would recommend using the multi-spectrum fungicides, either EBDCs or Captan, as you move into the summer cover sprays, and then looking at the strobies for the end of the season, unless we get a very big stretch, and by that I mean, like, say, a couple of weeks of warm, wet, thunderstormy weather. And this is exactly what we saw a couple of years ago, where we had a relatively dry period early on in the year, and then things switched over, and that's when we got this. This is I believe, a Honeycrisp meltdown that John got a picture of, and we saw a lot of that. So with that, I'm open to questions or turning it over back to Liz.